Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sheldon Zamek, and I'm president of the Canadian Associates of Ben Gurion University of the Negev. I'm so proud to be in this position tonight, and as you can see from this wonderful video, there are so many incredible innovations occurring every day at Ben Gurion. Tonight, we have a real treat for you. CABGU is pleased to present Integrating New Immigrants and Refugees Is There Hope? A lecture by renowned psychologist, Professor Emeritus from BGU, Solly Dreman. Although many of you in the room probably know Solly very well, I would still like to bring some information to your attention about his background. Solly made Aliyah to Israel in 1964. He got both of his master's and PhD in psychology from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He started his career as a teaching assistant at Hebrew University in developmental and social psychology in 1967. In 1980, Solly made his way over to Ben Gurion University, and over his tenure, Solly taught many subjects, and tonight's lecture will cover only a small sampling of his expertise. As many of you might know, Solly has been a clinical psychologist and has helped hundreds and hundreds of families. He was also the former head of the developmental psychology department at CABGU. He was also head of the intervention and treatment program at CABGU. He also is a Fulbright scholar from the University of California in San Francisco, and he is the publisher of many, many, many articles as well as 3 books. Now, I have to tell you this, it's very difficult to put on programs like this, and we're so fortunate tonight to have a number of partners, which I'd like to illuminate this evening. Our media partner tonight is the Jewish Post and Bernie Bellin, so I want to thank you very much. I want to thank the Winnipeg Friends of Israel and Yolanda Pepini-Kapalik. I want to thank the Jewish Foundation of Manitoba and Marsha Cowan and my good friend Rob Berkowitz. And I would like to also thank our Executive Director of BGU, Zach Ostrov, for all his work in coordinating this event. But I'd also like to thank all of you, all of our friends and supporters who've been here through this journey of resurrection of this organization. We are very, very thrilled at all the accomplishments that are occurring, and I think tonight's lecture is going to be very, very exciting for you. Before we complete this little introduction, I want to say that we're going to have a few questions after the introduction, after the lecture, and then we're going to have a lovely reception in the foyer, so I hope you'll all join us for that. Now, help me join me in welcoming Solly Dreman to the podium, and we're looking forward to your lecture.
Can you hear me? Okay. I guess I've said it a few times, and those of you I've met in the last few days, how delighted I am to be back in Winnipeg. I have to admit, I started my stay here with a bang. I had a small fall the other day when, yes, can you hear me clearly or not? I can use it. I'd prefer, you know what I can do is use this mic, and for the Q&A, I'd like to walk around. So can you hear this mic? Is this one's better. Okay, so we'll use it. Again, I just wanted to say that I'm delighted to be here. I thought I'd come out tonight like Scarface, but apparently I healed quickly, and so I'm really glad that I have an opportunity to address you and talk to you, and I think you're going to find the subject of interest. What I want to talk about tonight is about the integration of new immigrants and refugees in Israel and the world at large. As you're all aware, the refugee issue has really become predominant in the international arena, and it's wreaking havoc, as we all know, every day. fear and tragedy all over the world. One of the central issues in looking at refugees is the question of identity and belonging, the question of who am I, what am I, and to whom do I owe my primary allegiance? Am I first and foremost a Muslim, Jew, Christian, Israeli, Canadian, American, doctor, lawyer, or a collage of these? To illustrate, I want to introduce a quote of a respected author who's an Arab, a Muslim. His name is Amin Maalouf. He's a Catholic Arab from Lebanon living in France who wrote a book in 2003 that's very relevant and topical. The book is about the roots of terrorism, and it's called In the Name of Identity, Violence and the Need to Belong. And I quote Amin Maalouf, "How many times since I left Lebanon in 1976 to live in France have people asked me whether I felt more French or Lebanese? And I always gave the same answer, both. I say that not in the interest of fairness or balance, but because any other answer would be a lie. What makes me myself, rather than anyone else, is the very fact that I am poised between two countries, 2 or 3 languages, and several cultural traditions. I patiently explain that I was born in Lebanon and lived there until I was 27, that Arabic is my mother tongue, that it was in the Arabic translation that I first read Dumas and Dickens and Gulliver's Travels, and that it was in my native village that I experienced the pleasures of childhood and heard some of the stories that were later to inspire my novels. On the other hand, I have lived for 22 years on the soil of France. I drink her water and wine every day. My hands touch her ancient stones. I write my books in her language, and never again will she be a foreign country to me. Sometimes, after I have explained who I am to someone, they pat me on the shoulder and say, 'Hey, of course, but what do you really feel deep down inside?' The question presupposes that deep down inside, everyone has just one affiliation that really matters, a kind of fundamental truth, as if the rest of one's life, tastes, sensibilities, and affinities counted for nothing." I think you'll understand why I brought this passage after you hear what I have to say. Number 1, the historical background of the workshop. Okay. I'm now going to present some work on immigration. Is Bernie Bellin in the crowd? I think so. Hi, Bernie. Bernie, you reported on this about 20 some odd years ago, and it's old hat and old stuff, but I find it particularly relevant and poignant to what's happening in the world today. So let me just tell you a little bit about that work. The work was done on immigration in the 1990s and carried out by myself and a colleague, Dr. Eva Shinar, who was the head of the student counseling service in Israel and who I've worked with for over 30 years. By the way, you're going to see Eva tonight on video, but I don't want to jump the gun. I did the workshop with her over a decade ago, but the implications are certainly relevant to the problems, contemporary problems occurring in the world today, and to immigrant and refugee populations all over the world. Immigration is widely recognized as a stressful event which increases psychological vulnerability. Researchers have noted that adolescent immigrants, and we know that many terrorists are in that age group, they constitute an extremely high-risk population. In adolescence and late adolescence, there's a need to cope with profound physical, psychological, and social transformations. And in those adolescents who have become immigrants in a strange and often unwelcoming environment, the uprootedness and difficulties in establishing a solid base of identity and meaning could result in disastrous results. Indeed, the violence evidenced today in such places as Paris, Nice, Brussels, Orlando, St. Bernardino, and as well as in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, testify to this. Hence, youth, confronted with a strange environment, and difficult economic conditions, as well as lack of purposefulness in their lives, often latch on to causes and groups that implement terrorism and violence in the international community. Now back to Israel and the work that we did. In the 1990s, in the post-Glasnost and Perestroika eras, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a mass exodus of over 1 million Soviet Jews to Israel. Soviet students comprised about 10% of the student body at Ben-Gurion University, and of course were competing for limited resources such as dormitory space, scholarships, and eventually opportunities for employment. In addition, there were many negative stereotypes and attitudes prevailing between the native, what we call Sabra students, who were born in Israel, and their Soviet counterparts. By the way, in the title of the lecture, I also mentioned Ethiopian Jewry. I want to say that I'm going to refer mainly to our work with the Soviet Jewries, but later on we also found there was a real problem with the Ethiopians, particularly the way the Russians perceived them as subhuman, uncouth, uneducated, and so on. And after we heard what the Russians had to say, we created another workshop where we brought in Ethiopian students. As far as the stereotypes that Israelis had towards the Russians, well, they often viewed them as manipulative, clannish, and corrupt, while the Russian students perceived the Israelis as loud, aggressive, and uncouth. The Russians, when we saw the Russians themselves during that year, the first year of the workshop, we also heard some terrible things that they had to say about the Ethiopians. As I told you, subhuman, subspecies, monkey-like, etc. Now, I was then director, and had been for 12 years, of the Center for Family Life Research and Counseling at Ben-Gurion University. And at that time, it was brought to my attention by the president, as well as various student bodies, the student Histadrut Studenti, the student organization there, that there were conflicts on campus. It was brought to my attention that there was extreme annihilation between native Sabras and those new immigrant students, to the point of outright violence and fistfights. I was prevailed upon by the student and administrative officials at that time, and in my capacity as a clinical psychology and the director of a family treatment center, to think of ways in which these tensions could be reduced and more understanding, cooperation, and solidarity between these groups developed. Given this task, I felt that there was a profound need to build a bridge between the two cultures, with the process being reciprocal. Both groups learn to understand, accept, and maybe even adopt some of the characteristics of the other. At least this was my goal. Unlike many ordinary citizens, politicians, and civil administrators who believed they should become like us, I felt that it was important to create an atmosphere where each group participates in an evolving melting pot culture, where each side starts to listen to and understand the other side. Now, this wasn't an easy thing to do. And number two, the structure of the workshop. With this in mind, I and my colleague, Dr. Eva Shinhar, who I've worked with, by the way, in other areas such as divorce, crisis in the family, and similar areas of family strife, we decided to create a workshop which we called Aliyah as a challenge. And as you know, Aliyah means ascension to the Holy Land. This workshop was envisioned to promote the social, cultural, and academic integration of Soviet and later Ethiopian students at the university, and it had the following characteristics. First of all, we built it as an academic course with 2 academic credits, later 4, because it turned from a semester course into a year-long course because of its popularity. So students were given a reward for their participation in completing course assignments. This was particularly important for the Russians, who are really very pragmatic and wanted some payoff for their efforts. The syllabus of the course described it as designed to help students learn about family and individual transitions in the face of such normative phenomena as birth, adolescence, illness in the family, divorce, death, but with a particular emphasis on Aliyah, immigration.
This proved attractive to the Russian students since they had an aversion to the psychiatric establishment in the Soviet Union and didn't like to participate in services associated with psychological intervention. So advertising it as an academic course, and it had credit, had a certain pool for them, and it was good marketing. Also, the majority of Russian students weren't in the humanities. Most of them were studying courses in the natural sciences such as physics, mathematics, and engineering, and were not particularly attuned to psychology and the social sciences. Unlike previous attempts at intervention, I think that here we were really innovative. Previous work with immigrant groups usually employed homogeneous groups of immigrants, which were conducted in their native language and focused not on joining the new culture, but on mourning the loss of the culture from which they had emigrated. Our workshops were conducted from the start in Hebrew, and the participants consisted of both native and immigrant students, 13 of each in each group. Each group had 26 participants. And this was important since we wanted to encourage joining the new culture, of which part of the process includes learning the language and not just mourning the country we'd emigrated from. Emphasis was placed on a reciprocal dialogue, rather than the imposition of the host culture's values, attitudes, and behaviors on the new immigrant students. We stayed away from our Uncle Tom philosophy, be like us. We wanted them to listen to each other. And this was meant to encourage the evolution of new attitudes and behaviors through mutual engagement and exchange of ideas. Thus, while joining the host culture was encouraged, there was also an opportunity for the immigrant students to talk about their past, their childhood, and their youth, and not just about joining, but also about leaving. And it gave the hosts a chance to hear some of the dilemmas and problems of the new immigrants coming to the university. It, by the way, also helped the immigrant students to hear out the Israelis, because they also and verbosely expressed their attitudes and their expectations from the immigrant group. Such topics as childhood, educational experience, army service, cohabitation even of students, attitudes of each group towards the other, and other central issues were broached in the workshop, thus encouraging a framework for mutual understanding and tolerance. Normative aspects of immigration and transition were also discussed in an academic context, and this permitted participants to eventually discuss their own experiences in a non-threatening atmosphere and to place them in an appropriate context and non-threatening context to understand what they themselves were going through. A few theoretical models were presented, explaining stress in the family as being related to transition and change in the family life cycle. And God knows, we all know, that change is a difficult thing. The model of Carter and McGoldrick describes life cycle transitions as either being normative, like birth of a child, adolescence, the midlife crisis, the empty nest, or relatively unexpected but still frequent phenomena such as immigration, divorce, war, unemployment, and sudden illness. There are also factors related to the family's past history, such as mental illness, suicide, family myths, taboos, loaded attitudes. We are all successful, for example, which causes stress on the individual and the family as a whole. These different stressors interact with each other to cause a certain level of stress and vulnerability. For example, and many of you may even be familiar with such an example, a family with a history of psychotic breakdown in their children at age 18, and when they start to leave the home and venture out, they'll be at a relatively high risk when one of their progeny reaches the age of 18 and sets out for the army or for college. Hence, it's important when assessing families and individuals to consider these varied stressors. Students were asked to apply this model and others in order to understand their own cognitive thinking and emotional understanding of their own reactions to different life situations. And number 3, please, developmental aspects of migration. To illustrate this, by the way, the students were given projects during the year, like go out and interview Israelis and ask their attitudes towards Russians and vice versa. And a number of different projects. Describe your army service in Russia versus your service in Israel. To illustrate, and at the end of the year, they handed in a term paper on their work. By the way, they worked in small groups of 5 to 6 students, heterogeneous groups where Russians worked with native Israelis, and that served to be a factor in creating group cohesion. Let me just give you, I think, a lovely example of how this played out. A female student in the course from the former Soviet Union, following a developmental model presented in the classroom, described the process in a final term paper as follows. And she's talking about herself. And she's taking this from academia, the different stages. And let me describe what she had to say. First stage for her, losing focus. And I quote, "A short time after I came to Israel, I felt completely lost. What shall I do? I don't know the language. This country is completely foreign to me. Where do I begin?" The next stage we call minimizing the impact. And she says, "At this stage, I felt that things actually weren't so bad. The shops are full of goods, and one can purchase anything. I've been promised work, an apartment, a secure future, and there's no reason to worry." What's going to be the next stage, guys? Where do you go from the euphoria? The pit. Okay, the fall. "The situation is very difficult here," she says. "There's no work, even though there's an abundance of goods available, but I can't afford them." And then she goes on to the next stage called letting go of the past. "I'm already here. There's no way of return. I must learn to survive. I must leave the past behind and try to cope with the present." And then the next stage, number 5, testing the limits. "My situation's not so bad. I'm studying towards a master's degree. Now it's possible to think of new goals. I'm going to be a teacher at a Hebrew language center." Stage 6, the integration of vision and integration and fitting in. She said that she had not yet reached this stage and she was still working on it. Okay, that's 1. And let me say something, if I may, number 4, interest and enrollment. Yeah, okay. The response to the course was beyond all expectations, with over 100 students registering. Unfortunately, we could only accommodate 52 students because of financial resources. The heavy response, by the way, verified our hunch that many Russian speakers were anxious to meet, confront, and perhaps befriend native Israeli students. And also, a significant number of native students shared a similar inclination. We subsequently opened 2 workshops, each with 26 students, each workshop comprising half new immigrants and half native Israelis. And they were led by myself and my colleague, Dr. Shinhar, both of us with long experience in group dynamics. In order to overcome anxiety and to promote mutuality, each workshop was broken down to groups comprising, as I told you before, 5 to 6 students, with native Israelis and new immigrants included in each subgroup. At the weekly meeting, discussions were initiated on such loaded topics as the value of becoming part of Israeli society, maintaining cultural and social links with the motherland, recognizing and overcoming negative stereotypes, Israeli attitudes towards Russians and vice versa, service in the military, Israeli identity, and perhaps the most critical and sensitive issue of all, and we see that today in contemporary Israel, Jewish identity. Okay. An unanticipated factor was that nearly all of the Israelis were majoring in the social sciences, the native Israelis, and humanities, whereas their Russian counterparts were studying the natural sciences such as mathematics, physics, or engineering. This, coupled with the Israelis' fluency in Hebrew and the Russian students' more reserved manner, meant that the homegrown students tended to monopolize the proceedings at the outset. But after a few sessions and with a little prompting by us, the Russians became much more comfortable and much more vocal. Number 5, group dynamics in the workshop. Hey, the Blue Bombers did well yesterday, didn't they? 7 in a row. Okay, so some of the encounters were highly memorable. To illustrate how misguided were some Israeli perceptions of Russia, let me talk about Dmitry, a jovial engineering student who described a personal incident where he was stopped by a traffic cop for jaywalking through a red light and had to pay a fine. Since he was short of money, he was very upset. When an Israel engineering student, a buddy of his, offered to help him, he accepted the suggestion with relish. Dmitry told the group that his friend wrote a letter to the court, excuse me for laughing, I still laugh, in which he explained that Russia was a very primitive country with little traffic and no traffic lights. And since Dmitry did not realize that he had committed an offense, he should not be reprimanded. The wonderful thing, Dmitry added, is it worked. At another session, an Israeli girl stated and argued assertively that it was the responsibility of the newcomers to accommodate themselves to Israeli ways, while the Russian counterparts just smiled. Her Israeli compatriots took issue with her and suggested that she consider the melting pot nature of Israeli society, an immigrant society, and the need for all of us to understand and learn from the culture of others, both for good and for bad. On the other side of the ledger, it soon became clear that most of the Russian students had a rather low opinion concerning the cultural level of their Israeli colleagues. The Russians, by the way, are often very sophisticated, and a great emphasis is placed on education, and they're really aspirers. Israeli kids are too, but often they may portray a less cultured image because of other problems. But on the other hand, in the course of a heated discussion, it gradually dawned on the participants in both groups that the Russians, being hard-pressed financially, the Russian students, lived in relatively poor neighborhoods and primarily came into contact with disadvantaged Israelis, on the basis of which they made generalizations to the population as a whole. As the weeks passed, early inhibitions disappeared, and the groups gradually impacted on each other. One week, for example, several Russian students criticized the gaudy, exhibitionist way young Israeli women dressed. The following week, as if prearranged, almost all of the native Israeli female students turned up in relatively conservative attire, while the Russian girls were wearing considerably less conservative clothing. Number 6, effectiveness of the workshop. Well, to tell you the truth, at the end of the workshop, I can't say wholeheartedly that lifelong friendships were established like those prevailing amongst Israeli youth who have been in youth movements, share common army experiences, and the like. However, there were some positive changes in social interaction during the workshop. When we started the workshop, we handed out a questionnaire and we asked them, would you date with a Russian girl or a Russian boy or ever think of marrying them? And we asked the Israelis the same thing, 0, okay? At the end of this workshop, 7 out of 11 immigrant students tested, and 7 out of 12 native students tested, said that they had made friends with members of the other groups, real friends. And I think that's an accomplishment. Similarly, we noticed in the course of the workshop that deep-seated and potentially pernicious attitudes that had previously prevailed had begun to dissipate. The effect of the workshop also extended beyond the classroom. Several of the participants, both Russian and native Israelis, were members of the student council, and as opinion leaders, they probably influenced many of their fellow students. Similarly, being prestigious members of their respective communities, they probably influenced the opinions of many others beyond the walls of the ivory towers. Number 7, implications for the absorption of immigrants and refugee populations in the world. And I'm going to be modest here and reserved and non-political. Okay, from our workshop, I have some of the following, not conclusions, but suggestions. First of all, I think if we're trying to create a reciprocal dialogue and to listen to each other and recognize each other, we should have representative hosts of immigrants and hosts meeting in a non-competitive, positive setting that will permit mutual recognition and the reduction of negative attitudes, feelings, and behaviors. These groups should undertake cooperative tasks together in such areas as education, social welfare, social engagement, volunteer services, and you name it. The process should be reciprocal and interactive, not a teaching situation. Hey, do this and be like us. But it should be characterized by a dialectical process where both the hosts and the guests, the new immigrants, converse and exchange attitudes, feelings, and behaviors. We want to avoid a situation where the host expects the immigrant to be like them or where the immigrants remain entrenched in their own culture. Important and very important in the process, and my colleague Eva Shinar will allude to this, is the recognition and acceptance by both the host and the immigrant population of what we call the other. Okay? One of the things we tend to do, and when there's terrorism, is dichotomize them and us. They're bad, we're good. What we want to do is create an evolving identity. While emphasis is placed on joining the new culture, space should be provided for the immigrant representatives to give expression to their culture of origin and their particular needs and expectations. Also, the forum should provide the host an opportunity to express their expectations and some of the things that they expect from their new immigrant guests. On the larger educational level, I think, and I've always believed this, that you can prevent a lot of psychological treatment by education. And on the educational level, I think awareness workshops dealing with immigration should be introduced in citizenship class in elementary schools, high schools, and colleges. And also, if we're talking about the government and intervention on the government level, there is, by the way, Canada's doing a good job. I think you've got about 25,000 Syrians coming in this year. But there is cooperation, and there are a number of volunteer bodies that are doing this sort of work. For example, the Winnipeg Friends of Israel, and I give Yolanda Papino-Pollock great credit for the work that she's doing, trying to immigrate Yazidi families. But it's very important that government and voluntary groups get their act together and work together to help promote the absorption of immigrants. Okay, all that said and done, let's be real. Let's remember where we did the workshop. It's important to remember that our work was carried out in Israel with a focus on the absorption of Jewish immigrants. The common denominator of Jewishness made our task in setting up the workshop and facilitating the immigration process much easier. The fact that Israel is an immigrant-friendly society with a ministry of absorption, a law of return, which grants automatic citizenship to Jews from the diaspora, as well as providing other benefits for new immigrants, renders the comparison made with Europe, America, and other places in the world not completely equal. But what I want to differentiate between when we're talking about intervention abroad, if I may be so bold as to even talk about it, is that I think that we have to distinguish between immigrant and refugee populations. We have to distinguish between immigrants who want to emigrate and refugees who are expelled or exiled and may not necessarily want to. And there is a difference. I believe that the workshop that we did would be conducive in aiding immigrant groups who have a genuine desire to become part of the mainstream of the host culture. I think that our workshops would be effective. As far as more radical groups are concerned, radicalized by religiosity, nationalism, or whatever, and again, I'm being very careful not to be political, and like Mr. Obama, not using that word. But I think we have to be careful. And I haven't got the solutions for that. I think that there's really a need to find tools for working with radicalization. And there are tools, but none of them to date, as far as I know the literature, have been completely successful. Just on a last note, and then I want to show you the video of myself and Ava. It should be noted that we concentrated on a population comprising late adolescents meaning 18, 19, up to 23, 24, and young adults. This age group is particularly vulnerable to radicalization and recruitment to terrorist organizations and or individual acts of violence, as we've all well seen, even in New York and in St. Cloud, Minnesota last night. The identity crisis in this age group is very strong, and this combined with the poverty, unemployment, and purposelessness experienced by these groups, as well as the inherent hostilities generally prevailing between the host and the immigrant cultures, requires that new and innovative ways to deal with these be implemented. Okay, before we go on to the Q&A, and I'll be delighted to entertain your questions, and Zach, you'll help me with this. Let's see the video of myself. Again, this is Dr. Eva Shinhar, a 30 or 40-year colleague of mine. We were both new immigrants in Israel, and we thought it would be instructive perhaps to talk a little bit about our own experience. So without further ado, please, go ahead, Jerry.
Okay. Eva, it's great to see you.
It's great to see you.
You know, it's a long history.
Yeah.
30 years. Two old new immigrants meeting together in Jerusalem. You now live in Beersheba.
Yeah,
you have
in
kids
Omer.
In Omer. You have kids in Tel Aviv, as do I. And
we're still in touch.
We're still in touch. Me originally from Canada. You originally from Poland. It's a long story.
Yeah.
But we've worked together a long time, and I want to tell you, for me, you've been a major part of my identity. Okay?
Well,
and I appreciate you. And listen, without further ado, talk a little bit about yourself, because we're talking about identity, and I think it's a very, very focal and important issue, not only in Israel, with our influx of immigrants from many countries, including Russia, Ethiopia, etc., but worldwide. God knows the refugee crisis today. So please, without further ado.
Okay. Thank you, Solly. Solly, hi. I'm glad to be here.
I'm delighted that you're here.
And I will talk a little bit about my experiences as a new immigrant in Israel, which was years ago. But what I want to say is that it's not by chance that you and I got so interested in the area of immigration and absorption, because we're both old new immigrants.
Very old.
Yeah. You came from Canada in 1964, and you were already in your 20s, I think.
Yeah. I was 25.
And you came to be a graduate student at the Hebrew University. And I came to Israel as a young adolescent at the age of 12. And I came from Poland. And what I would like to do is just tell you a little bit about some of the very early experiences that I remember and were quite traumatic for me. I came to Israel knowing almost nothing about Judaism, because I came from a very assimilated family, and knowing no Hebrew whatsoever. So the first phrase I learned was, I don't know Hebrew, because I was very concerned that people may ask me directions or something, and I will not understand what they have to say. We came in June, and in September I went to the 7th grade. We came to a small town in Israel, which really didn't have many immigrants. So people were not so accustomed to dealing with those newcomers. I remember that when I came to school the first day, the teacher asked me what my name was, and I said that my name was Eva. And he looked at me and said, from now on, your name will be Chava, which is the Hebrew equivalent of Eva. And of course, I accepted that and came home that day and said to my mother, from now on, you have to refer to me as Chava. And my mother was in shock. And of course, it was very difficult for her to call me Chava. And she continued calling me by all kinds of nicknames in Polish. But when we were on the street, she was very careful and with my friends, and she called me Chava. What was going on in Israel at that time was I think a denial of differentness, and the new immigrants were expected to learn Hebrew very quickly and to put their previous identities behind. For my mother, my name was very significant because I was named by my mother. She chose that name because as a Holocaust survivor, she was saved in Poland during the war by a Polish physician whose daughter's name was Eva. And my mother promised herself that if she would ever survive and if she would ever have a daughter, she would call her Eva.
In honor
of that physician. So for her, it was, very difficult to accept this arbitrary change of my name. But I think the change of the name was a very traditional, very normal kind of thing. And it really emphasized the lack of understanding of what people who come with a culture and then with identity go through when they have to adjust to the new culture.
Their identity overnight and abandon their old identity.
Yeah. So within a year, I already knew Hebrew, and I was a very good student. Mm-hmm. And I guess I kind of forgot about all those experiences. 50 years later, which was 2 years ago, okay, we come together to that town for a class reunion. High school reunion. But the kids who were with me in the elementary school also were with me in high school. Okay. And it's a very happy occasion, and we all look at each other, trying to recognize who is who. And then we talk about experiences in school, and all of a sudden, those recollections, which were not happy recollections, and the sense of being different dawns on me after many years in Israel, where I am a regular Israeli, like everybody else, and have been here for many, many years. All of a sudden, I feel like I felt when I was that girl of 12, feeling so different and so unrecognized for her difference.
A sense of alienation.
And sadness also. Yeah.
I understand.
So I'm glad we devised that group together, because had I had that group at the time, it would have been probably much easier to adjust to.
Well, Ava, thanks for sharing those intimate and very powerful experiences with us. I just wanted to say that what you said, if I could sum it, is simply that nobody has a identity. All of us have a number of identities. You, as a young Polish girl who came to Israel, integrated into the Sabra culture, became a psychologist, became a mother, became a grandmother. Your life and your identity evolves. It's never static. And I think that this is a lesson that many of us forget. And I think that this was the purpose of our workshop, to make both the host and the new immigrant understand where the other person is coming from.
Exactly.
And trying to create a merging of cultures and understandings in order to ease the process of assimilation and integration.
Yeah.
It's not an easy task. I think the beautiful part of our workshop was that it was a workshop that didn't adapt an Uncle Tom philosophy that you be like us or else.
Uh-huh.
Instead, it was based on reciprocity. And I think that the workshop that we did was very successful. You know, in that workshop, at the beginning, as you remember, the Russians hated members of the other group. When we had Ethiopians in the group, they hated the Russians. At the end of the group, when we measured their attitudes, we found that almost all of them had befriended members of the other group. So what I want to say is that basically, if we can create a culture where there's a chance to merge understandings, values, expectations,
and the recognition of the differences.
It's a major thing.
And accepting the differences.
I'm not so sure that's going to work with everybody. And tonight I'm going to speak a little bit about the international situation. If people, new immigrants, generally desire to become part of the host culture, I think there's real opportunity for mutual understanding.
Okay.
But when you're faced with extreme religiosity or nationalism or whatever, and perhaps a group that's very difficult to change because of identity crisis, particularly young adolescents, the problem is a different one, and I'll try to touch on that tonight. But anyhow, Ava, it's wonderful seeing you.
Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure, and as
good
they
luck.
say in French,
good luck in Winnipeg.
Thank you, and to be continued.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you. First of all, I want to thank you very much for coming out and hosting me tonight. And I'm glad that you've seen a little bit of our work and a little bit about our university, which, by the way, is a great university. They call it the sexy university in Israel because it really is sexy. It's involved in the community and not only in academia, but we do a lot of good real-life things. And thanks to Sheldon and people like him, I think that we're going to go on to a new era. By the way, I understand, Sheldon, there's a new project going on in cardiology, cooperation between Ben Gurion and St. Boniface Hospital, right? But in any event, I'm not promoting tonight. I'm not here as a promoter. I wanted to bring a message to you. And I'll be delighted to entertain questions. Can we shut that light there? Okay, I can't see you. Okay, so please. Yeah, go ahead.
This workshop / course that you offer 1 year as an interest project review, or did it go on many years?
It went on for 4 years. It started off as a 1-semester course. It became so popular that it turned into a 2-semester course, and we were overwhelmed. By the way, I came to Canada to try to recruit funds because we didn't have the funds to go on, and it's really a shame. Again, I'm not here recruiting. I'm emeritus right now, so I have no personal interest. But it went on for 4 years, and it was highly, highly successful. After the first 2 years, we opened it up to Ethiopian students, and we put the Ethiopians in together with the Russian immigrants, and they went kasach, they say in Hebrew. They went at each other. But really, it caused a merging and understanding. By the way, you have to remember that the kids participating in this workshop are students. So obviously they're representative role models, and you're in a setting where you can cooperate and really talk. I want to show you how important the setting is, if I may, just by illustration of one of the projects we did. We sent kids out in one of the groups to interview Israelis, native Israelis, concerning their attitudes to Russian, okay? We sent one group out to Machane Yehuda marketplace, which is a very competitive marketplace, Russian and native Israeli peddlers, etc. And another group to interview people in Dizengoff Center, which is middle upper class, nice people, academics, intellectuals. How did the native Israelis describe the Russians in the marketplace? Swindlers, crooks, gamblers, prostitutes, bastards. In Dizengoff Center, more power to them, wonderful, contribute to the nation, and so on and so on and so forth. So again, by the way, the whole question of perception and profiling is very important, and there's really a need for not a clashing of culture, of a merging of cultures, but you can't always do that. Obviously, trying to work in the Muslim community where they're isolated, some of them,
and they're not open to dialogue is very, very difficult to do. And so, again, circumstances are going to dictate the kind of intervention that you have. But again, on the whole, and again, I want to again be modest and say we were lucky in that we had the common element of Judaism and an immigrant-friendly country and highly educated kids and an opportunity to talk. I'm not sure that that's always possible, but I think it is possible. I think that in Europe and in North America, if somehow they could take a select group of people, hosts and immigrants, put them in groups together and let them go out, have that encounter and then spread the gospel, speak to their own neighbors and friends. Hey, they're not so bad as we thought they were, kind of thing. I think it would be useful. I think that part of the problem is that we tend to singularize, to dichotomize and classify, which at the outset prevents any kind of listening and merging and melting pot opportunities. So I think that this is something that we really have to work on. When I say we, I mean educators, psychologists, people who, everyday citizens, to try to be careful how we profile. Sometimes you have to profile. There are many people who say, hey, at Ben Gurion Airport, they pick out darker people and go through their luggage, etc. I say, what can you do? Sometimes you just have to. But in the day-to-day course of living, I think that there are ways of merging, understanding, recognizing, and creating some sort of a melting pot. Yeah, please.
It's 20 years later. Did you do any follow-up sort of 20 years after where the people are?
I didn't have the funding to do, and it's too bad. And by the way, I want to tell you, I still don't think they're doing the things that we did. That's why, where's Bernie? Bernie, do you remember covering? I didn't know, I was afraid when I came tonight that you'd say, hey, Solly, that's old stuff. I've heard this already. But it's not old stuff.
2 days ago, 20 years.
Yeah. Pardon me?
I think this, where you are now, the Aspen campus,
Yeah.
is a perfect example of integrating immigrants, refugees, Jews, non-Jews.
Not only that, demographically, the elderly and the younger, having facilities for the elderly with kindergartens or whatever.
No, in Israel, I mean, it seems hard to understand. You have something like 126 different ethnic groups in Israel.
Yeah.
So it's just a question of time, isn't it? Before almost every group would identify to a certain extent with the large. After all, the Army is a major integrative tool. From what I've been thinking of, the fissures in Israel are between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim, the secular and the religious.
There are many fissures in
Yeah,
Israel.
and the attitudes towards the Palestinians. In time, though, it seems that Israel is going to be split along different lines than your ethnic affiliation now, isn't it? It's more.
Absolutely. By the way, if you take a look at Israel,
Well,
we've got our own problems, just very recently. I don't know if you've heard what's been happening in the Ethiopian community, that they're being over-policed. And just like the blacks in America, you get a group of Ethiopian kids standing on the street at night and they're liable to be accosted by the police and patted down. They've just had demonstrations. And so there's a lot of schisms in Israeli society. It's a great country, and I personally think it's the greatest country in the
I
world.
just want to relate to that. Last night I was coming in here, and we have the Yazidi refugees in
Right.
and the father, Mr. Nassau, was coming in. And I said, Mr. Nassau, you're going to the campus. And I thought that was terrific. They feel comfortable enough. That's people from coming into the campus. I don't know if he's coming to exercise or pick something up, but it's so
Just
nice to
at home.
see that. Yeah, this was just sort of felt at home.
Unfortunately, in Israel, that doesn't
doesn't happen always with the Palestinians. And for example, when you take a look at the city of Jerusalem today, the east city as compared to the western city, they're two completely different worlds. And the hostility and the hate that exists in many of both sides, both sides, is. So I don't know, I'd like to think, there are those who say never the twain shall we meet, I don't know. I'd like to think that there's a solution. I'm not sure at this point in time there is a solution. I think that what usually happens is that when people try to merge and listen to each other and the moderate elements of both sides come together and talk, if it's the Palestinian side, their life is in danger when they go back home. And then whenever there's any sort of progress towards peace, someone plants a bomb, there's some attack of violence, and then there's counter-violence. And it's very complicated. I'm optimistic. I think Israel is a great country. It has great human resources. It has people who are aware, social scientists, people in technology, etc., are doing great things. But we have problems. One of them is today in Israel is that the right has become right, and religiosity has been a factor that's influencing things in directions that I'm not happy about. For example, in the army, all sorts of things are going, separation, sometimes even between women and men, soldiers, and certain ceremonies and so on and so forth. The officers' training course, where some of the people who are training officers are themselves radicalized, and they're very myopic in their perception of we Jews versus the Goyim kind of thing. And fortunately, there are a lot of thinking people in Israel. The left and people with the left, that's another story. But there certainly are liberal elements in Israel and people who want peace. The problem today is that we have a country with Mr. Netanyahu, who has prevailed for 11 years, and a political genius. I don't agree with all of his move, but apparently somewhere he's touching a nerve in the country that seems that security and protection is being very major. I don't want to go any further than that.
So,
Yeah.
you alluded to the Ethiopians that we went to, but
To
the Ethiopian
Yeah.
population. But now the Ethiopians have been there 30, 40 years, and now you're in the second generation. How well have they integrated? How
A
the
lot
second
of them are
generation?
integrated, and for example, the media now, they make special efforts to have Ethiopian broadcasters. In the military, I think there's even a couple of officers who, they're integrating, and many of them are very intelligent, but listen, unfortunately, black is black, and for some reason, it seems to touch a chord in humanity that results in discrimination. And they are a relatively impoverished community, and they don't have the protection, nepotism, that traditional WASP, you know what a WASP is in Israel, don't you? What's a WASP in Israel? White, Ashkenazi, Sabra, and protection. So they don't have that, and so there's a real problem. By the way, I don't know if you heard, the other day, Commissioner of Police, police commissioner, made a statement that there was some act of violence in Kenya, saying that, well, yes, we do over-police them and perhaps over-profile them, but it's known that refugee populations are more problematic. And everyone, a lot of people agree with fire. It's problematic, and also, we talked about schisms, there's so many schisms in Israel. Sfaradi, Ashkenazi, religious, non-religious, national religious versus Haredi. Israel has infinite dichotomies, and it's a wonder that the country has progressed and gone to the stage that it has. It's been, by the way, very exciting for me as a native Winnipegger who loves Winnipeg, but I would have been bored to death here. Are you hearing me? Yeah? Can you hear me? Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question. You emphasize all these differences. Yes, Russians are racially and culturally different than Ethiopians.
I never said that.
No,
I'm saying they had their answers.
Now the question is, what do all these groups have in common? It's not the secular culture, it's not the color of the skin.
I said Jewishness.
It's the Torah, it's not Jewishness.
It's not the Torah.
It's Judaism.
It's not the
It's Judaism.
Torah is part of it.
Because the Ethiopians don't have the same culture as East Europeans. The East Europeans aren't the same as Moroccans or Yemenites.
I'm not sure that I understand the question.
No, the question, these are our roots. This is why we're Jews. We're not Jews because we lived in a Jewish land for 3,000 years.
We're Jews because we have a set of values. I would like to think liberal values, caring for humanity, etc.
Yeah.
The Torah is part of that.
Yeah.
It certainly is not the whole story, but there are some people in Israel who think that the Torah is the whole story. And so it's a mitzvah to kill it. And I'm on that page.
Here's Solly.
Over here.
She's being American.
Oh, okay. Yes.
This lecture is very connected to what I'm trying to do now here through Welcome Place.
Are you working with refugees?
Yes, I'm a host-matching specialist at Manitoba Interfaith Integration Council.
Oh, great.
Federal government is funding a new program now to build a bridge between local people and refugees.
Great.
Well, there is always like something like us and them, as you mentioned.
Which is dangerous.
Exactly, and I'm trying hard, and all of us, I believe, we are trying hard to, match families, Canadian families with refugee families, so they will help them to integrate, to,
That's wonderful.
adjust. Exactly, but what is your view and perspective and recommendation to the best way to build these bridges
I just said it.
beyond?
I think that if you create a task force, groups that we did in Beersheba can be a template for the groups that you should create. Take groups of representative immigrants who are verbal, who are earning a living, who are role models in their own culture, who can talk. Bring in hosts who are volunteers, who are interested in working on different areas like education, social encounters, welfare. Get them to talk to each other. Let them swear at each other and let them also.
See, the problem is the goal, or let's say the target, is the very vulnerable people, refugees who doesn't speak English.
I understand.
They are very isolated.
So what you have to do, and I've talked about this in Israel, you have to have, when you have a group, let's say, of new immigrants who don't speak the language, in Israel, of course, is a major problem because, for example, in wartime, what does a new immigrant do when he doesn't speak the language? He hasn't got contact. He doesn't even know what an Arabic sign means sometimes. You have to have people in each community who are key figures, who can be translators or bridges between the host culture and the immigrant population. So at the outset, if you're organizing, find a few people in your community who are focal people, who have the information at their fingertips, who can get on the phone or whatever way to communicate and tell people and help them organize meetings between the local locals and these are the kind of things that you can do. Get them talking with each other. Get them speaking the language. You get, I believe in Canada, there's efforts being made to resettle immigrants. And the language is part of the package. That's very important. Language is, as you see by the one thing, first thing we did was not have a homogeneous group just crying about what they left, but we had heterogeneous groups of immigrants and hosts speaking the language which is the language of the country, where they're going to have to work, become full citizens, and that works. So those are the kind of suggestions I agree.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I know that in early days of Israel, there was an attempt to create a melting pot.
Yolanda, you want to come forward a bit so we can see?
I understand.
Do you know Yolanda? Winnipeg Friends of Israel?
Everyone know.
There was an attempt in early years of Israel, and in fact I had the same experience because my name is not a Hebrew name, with a teacher who wanted to change my name from Yolanda to Ilana. there was an attempt to sort of create a melting pot. There is an Israeli, you have to speak Hebrew, your name has to be...
Well, not an attempt, exactly, not to create a melting pot. That's not the melting pot for me. But there was an attempt to convert.
To convert,
to make you like them.
I say melting pot because I think over the years it changed, and now it's more like a fruit salad. And I think Canada is like that too. It's more like a fruit salad. You're encouraged to keep your identity, to be proud of your identity, and at the same time become part of the new society that you're there. And I'm just wondering if that is working better.
I'm exactly on page with that. When my daughter now, I have a daughter, Dalit, who's living in Palo Alto. She saw this film. She's a doctor. You know what she said to me?
No, what?
She said, you know, this is what I believe. You know, I want you to know that in Palo Alto, my children every year are encouraged, every family, and there are a lot of immigrants, to bring food from home, speak their language at home, to share their culture with us. She was less sympathetic to Israel, but that's another story. But I'm with you on that one. I think it's so important. And this is actually what Ava said. She talked about recognition. And recognition means recognizing the culture you come from, recognizing the culture you're being integrated into, and perhaps having a sharing of both cultures. You know, in a melting pot society, in an immigrant society, immigration can be a very positive thing. And I'm all for that one.
So you think it's working better? Because I know, like, when I was growing up, you know, everybody had to speak Hebrew. And even my parents who spoke a different language spoke Hebrew at home, so,
you know what, Yolanda, I don't know if it's working. I think that there's certain...
No, but I know, like, with the Russian immigrants now in Israel, a lot of the new immigrants don't speak the language. They have TV in Russian and radio in Russian, and they go to entertainments in Russian.
Well, that still happens. I'll tell you where it happens. It happens in communities that are intelligent, that have resources, that are large, and they sometimes remain Israel. This is what happened with the Yetis, the German Jews that came to Israel originally. They didn't move outside of their communities. They spoke German at home and so on and so forth. By the way, it's also a question of what language do you speak. For example, someone who comes from an Arabic country is not going to speak Arabic because it's not considered a prestige language. Okay, someone who comes from Eastern Europe probably won't speak Polish because it's not. I was going to talk about my experience too. I was lucky. When I came to Israel, I spoke English. And I found that in academic setting, everyone wants to speak English because English is a prestige language. They want it. And by the way, you talk about profiling, I remember an instance where I went to the license bureau to get a license for my car. And the person in front of me was Moroccan. And he comes to the clerk, and the clerk says, "Where's your identity card?" I said, "I haven't got it. Go home." I come to the same clerk, said, "Where's your identity card?" I forgot it. "No problem." So, you know, I don't know, but it's a matter of situation and circumstance. It's multidimensional. You can't, you know. I think Israel really makes attempts to learn the other. For example, with the Ethiopian immigration, there were tremendous problems of aggression, suicide, repressed anger, and we sent out anthropologists to learn their culture and try to understand it. For example, banning a father from the home because he was violent might work in an Ashkenazi culture, but in the Ethiopian community it was a no-no, and so they created Ethiopian social workers to go out to those communities and try to work to help immigration. It's multidimensional, there are no answers. I'm optimistic that Israelis are smart enough to do the job, and eventually we will have a melting pot and a great country. It already is a great country.
Anyone else?
Isn't there a difference between like Canada versus U.S.? In the United States, it's the melting pot theory. In Canada, we adopted multiculturalism.
I don't understand the difference.
Well, the hyphenated, French Canadian, Nigerian Canadian, Filipino Canadian. In the States,
The implication being?
In the States, you're expected to be American. Apparently.
I don't know. In the States, I really don't know what you mean by expected. I don't think so. I think it depends where you live in the United States. I think if you live in the Midwest and you're a Muslim, you're going to have more, people just aren't going to understand, but there are other more liberal parts of America, maybe Stanford, the West Coast, where you do have large immigrant populations, more tolerant populations. I don't like to say Americans do or Canadians do. It depends where. But I really do. Anyone else? Yes.
I just missed the last October, I remember hearing that, I think it was my eye, that this was spent $160,000 on this new immigration.
Honey, is that true or not? I didn't hear. $150,000. It seems like high to me. I don't know. If so, I think I'm going to become a new immigrant. Okay. And I want to thank you very, very much.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming out. Once again, one big hand for Solly Dreman. Ask that everyone please join us in the foyer for some refreshments and have a good night.